Hello everyone and welcome to the Gunpla Network. I'm the Spicer and today's review of the Real Grade 00 Riser from Gundam 00 Season 2 comes to you courtesy of those fine folks over at Canadian Gundam. Canadian Gundam is your one-stop shop for all your Plamo and Gunpla needs here in North America, and when you're checking out with them, be sure to use the promo code Gunpla Network for 10% off. And in terms of just my overall thoughts after building it and posing it for a good while, I'd have to say it's a fun build. It is a little bit more complex and it's different from the Exia, so even if you have that, this isn't going to be just an exact rebuild. It has enough going on, to say the least, that it's going to make it well worth the build. In terms of posability, it has that extra level of complexity, I'll say that. There are things you're going to really need to be conscious of when you're posing it. Some things are going to fall off. It's a real grade. If you're not careful, this will happen anyway. But I would say even more so with this kit. And in terms of the visuals, it does look really good with minimal panel lining. If you don't put a ton of work into it, it's still a real grade. It's still going to look good. You've got two shades of white. You've got your bone white and your normal white. And the bone white's interspersed pretty well. So you do get it subtly in the arms and the legs. You only get one color of blue, but it's in the way it's put in, regardless pretty much of how it's lit, there's going to be shade and some shadow. So it does look like there's maybe multiple colors there. And then you get a little bit of red splashed in between all the gray. So it's visually pretty striking. If you add the stickers or top coat or extra panel lining or any paint, of course it's going to look a little better, but just with the GN stickers, a little bit of panel lining, it looks pretty good. So overall, pretty solid, but let's take a finer look. In terms of comparing it to its predecessor, overall I would have to say, well, the 00 Riser is much bigger and in terms of engineering slightly more complex. The Exia is significantly more stable. And there are a couple of things I feel that are downgrades, mostly nitpicky of course, but there are a couple things that for a real grade I feel like would have been nice to see. Going from the Exia to the 00, you lose an extra shade of blue that the Exia had, which is not the worst thing in the world, but there's enough blue on this kit that there are several pieces you could have had a different shade of blue on and gave it more of that real grade feel, much like they did with the bone white on this, and they did the same thing with the Exia. So, a little strange. It's not the biggest problem in the world, especially since you get the riser and the beam effects and everything. There's more than enough in the box to make it worth the actual price, but it would have been nice to see. In terms of the really other big downgrade between the two is the stability. For the 00 Riser, you're gonna need a stand for the most part. Having the riser back on, which as you can see I haven't had for the last two shots, is really the only way you're gonna get it to stand without one. The riser is just too heavy for the hips to hold it up. So the whole unit doesn't tip back, but at the waist it does bend backwards and the legs start to push out. So it eventually does fall over, which is a pretty big problem. Now, myself, if I'm gonna have it standing just on its feet, I'm just gonna remove the riser, right? It doesn't add a lot, it's on the back, you don't see it anyway. But having it on a stand does really eliminate that, so if you like the idea of having this in a really dynamic pose, that's gonna be the way to go. But that's really the only big other difference. The Exia is a lot more stable, but that's partially due to the design, so we really can't fault the real grade 00 Riser for that. Even without the signature multiple blue or multiple red or multiple gray color of the real grade, we do get a couple of different shades of white, which is just the bone white and the traditional regular white. So it is nice to see that variation. I do have to say, I don't say it's a waste, but I feel like there's a couple of other places it could have gone. The handle for the GN Sword 3 does cover one big portion of it, so once again, not a huge deal. Just something to note, you do get it on the shins and the tops of the forearms, so they're in pretty good places as far as placement. There are a couple of other additions, maybe the little part that goes under the bicep armor, or part of the knee or a part of the upper thigh or something like that would have been nice, but once again, very nitpicky things, not a huge deal. Now, in terms of the actual up-close detail, I do have to say there's a lot of really good panel lighting opportunity. You get it pretty much all over the main unit and then a bunch on the riser. Like, the riser is where most of your lighting opportunity is going to come from. You've got some pretty good stuff on the main unit, the legs, the arms, the chest, the head, but really where you're getting it is the riser unit itself. The wings I've left undone, but you can see in the detail shots here that you're going to get a pretty good amount of options. If you do want to do black, gray, do a wash, you've got a lot to work with. In terms of the overall visual proportions and everything, it does look good. I do say I think the Exia head was probably a little too big. I think proportionally it matched a little bit better, as I feel like the real grade 00 is maybe just a hair small. It is really easy to say that though, because this is a much bulkier unit, so it's a little bit of a trade-off. They're probably pretty close in size, just the actual unit itself is proportionally much different. But purely visually speaking, on a shelf, this is going to look good against pretty much any other 00 thing you've got up there. Whether it's a master grade, another real grade, a high grade, a no grade, it's going to look good. As small as it is, you've got enough surface detail that's very evident, especially if you do a wash or you panel line it. But even if you don't throw the stickers, just purely out of box, it's going to look good. Now, of course, if you put some stickers on it and some finish, it's going to look great. If you find some water slides or dry transfers that are like extra special decals, you could do that as well, and it would look great. But the nice thing about this is, as busy as it is, it's still fairly simplistic in its approach and looks very good without an exuberant amount of detail on it. Just purely speaking, visually, the only real issue I have is that head. Everything else, visually speaking, is great. Feet are a little small, but that's not necessarily that unusual for 00. The head looks fine. At first, I was a little wonky on it. I was like, oh, this is a little small, but the more I think about it, the more I look at it, I think it is just a proportional difference comparative to the Exia. But overall, visually speaking, everything you're getting in the box is good. If you don't want to mess with it, you don't have to, but a little bit of love goes a real long way with something like this. Now, in terms of posing, like I said, you're gonna really need a stand. There's not a good way to pose this on the ground, and part of that's just kind of how it's portrayed in the animation. You don't really see this fighting a lot on the ground like you did the Exia, so a stand, pretty important for posing this, even if you want a standing static pose. Unless you're removing that back portion of the 00 riser, you're gonna need a stand. But overall, it has enough accessories, even minor ones, that you can pull off a lot of really cool things. So as you can see here, we've got kind of the reaching pose, and I used the regular real grade hand for this. It does have a pre-posed action hand, which we'll see a little bit later, but I did want to use this just to show off it comes with them, and if you want it, it's there. But it actually doesn't look terrible in this, and this is pretty much the only thing I think I would use it for, with one minor exception. It doesn't hold a lot of things very well, and the peg system doesn't work super well with it, especially since you've got two pre-posed holding hands. So not a huge use for these, but overall I think they're okay. In general though, you can get some pretty good poses with this. You're just going to need to be super careful. Like I said, a couple of parts are going to pop off if you're not kind of forward thinking, and even while I was trying to plan out the poses for the review, I still dropped a lot of pieces. So it could be mine, but with the way this works, I can kind of foresee this being, I don't want to say a common issue, but something that's possible. So the GN Sword 2, the left one of mine likes to pop off for some reason. I don't know if it's just I move in a way that's always the one I knock off, but I would say it's a little more sensitive, but I have had both of them to fall off. The connector's not terrible. It fits into the side skirt really well, but it doesn't fit into the GN Sword 2's terribly great. Then the binders or the wing parts of the GN riser, or the 00 riser, my left one once again falls off. Something about the left is just problematic for me. But overall, it is something that they lock in very well at the GN drive in terms of like the movement of that portion. So there's kind of some counterbalances. If you know that it's going to be an issue, take it off before you pose it, because that's the only way you're going to get out of it sane without dropping or losing anything. But overall, it looks really good once you've got it in a pose. So it's one of those kits that it's not the easiest thing to pose in the world, but it does pay off when you get it posed. It does take on dynamic poses very well. One thing I will note about the stand adapter, the way it's built is the connection is. It's the same connection the Exia is, but instead of being on the flat bottom portion of the waist, it's actually like at an angle on the back, kind of at like a 45-degree angle, and you can kind of see it a little bit as it goes around, but that is gonna, I don't say complicate things, just another thing you have to think about when you're posing something like this. If it's going to naturally be at an angle, so I need to adjust my stand accordingly. It does actually lean into some really nice angled, like forward facing or backwards facing, like forward advance retreat type situations in terms of posability. So it is really kind of a cool thing. I'm not the biggest fan of it, but I think it does kind of have its own little quirk to it. Now, in terms of that other holding hand, or the actually pre-posed one, here we see it with the GN Sword 3, and it looks really good. Once again, it's not going to be one of those things I think I'm going to use a lot, but it is nice that they gave you these extra hands. Mostly because the real grade hands aren't really great for something like this. They do the job, they're never going to be that level of maneuverability or posability to be able to fan out like that, especially with 3 of them being connected. And while that doesn't look bad, this is leagues and bounds better. Pretty much the same pose. The one thing I will say here, you do have to move the whole side skirt to get the GN Sword 2s to move, so kind of keep that in mind. And the shoulders, as with almost every other real grade before it up until maybe like the tall geese, love to pop off. I mean, I've had this issue with the Exia, I've had it with every seed kilt I've built so far, the Ailstrike, the Destiny, the Freedom. That connection's just not super stable. It's not a huge deal because they go on pretty easy, just something to be considerate of, as once again, if you're posing this, they're probably going to pop off. And while the 00 riser is kind of the main attraction, I did want to pull off a couple of poses with it just being the 00 Gundam. And it still looks good, and honestly, a lot easier to work with. So this is kind of what I was talking about. As you can see, the stand is straight up and down where the peg is, but due to where the connection point is, it does kind of have like a falling backwards angle. I also attached one of the beam effect parts for the GN Sword 2. Once again, I like the GN Sword 2. It's not as striking as the GN Sword 3, but they look okay. The beam effect part helps and is much more of a like blasting beam effect, I feel like, than a sword portion. I know that's probably what they were going for, but the way it attaches, it works like this in beam rifle mode, but when you turn it, it's perpendicular to the blade. Like it doesn't run the right way, so I guess you can still use it, just a little strange. But overall, even in just the 00 form, if you want to have the riser on its own, it does look good, and it pulls off a lot of good solid poses without being too complex. Are the GN Sword 2s all that flashy? Not terribly, but they look good, and they're pretty stable. They do have a weird double peg system that I've not 100% figured out yet. I think one's for the sword and one's for the blaster, but they're really only going to work in the holding hand. I've had a lot of issue getting them to work in the real grade hand, so I'm just probably never going to use those for this purpose. But I do feel like the GN Sword 2s get slept on a lot. They're a really cool design, and it's kind of a shame that they get kind of slept on. But kind of give us a little bit of a, not necessarily an Attack on Titan pose, but something where you're going to be swinging both blades in one direction, kind of tilting or moving the torso a little bit, show off a little of that articulation. With the 00 riser unit on, you're not going to get to move around a lot in the torso, so it is kind of nice to bring it back to a simpler form factor to be able to make those decisions in terms of posing. And here we have it with the 00 riser and the GN Sword 3 connected. Now, one thing I will have to say is I spent about 25 minutes trying to get the wrong base adapter on the connection point for the GN Sword 3 for the 00 riser. There are two different base adapters that come in the box, one for the 00 Gundam and one for the riser. It's very obvious, and I'm stupid for not looking, but one of them has little clips on the inside, one of them does not, or at least they're not as noticeable if they are. The one with no clips goes on the riser, the one with clips slides into the kind of angled back portion of the 00. The little rod there is actually for the Real Grade Justice Gundam. I haven't built it yet, but I do want to take that out to see if it matches the little plug in the 30-minute mission cityscape stand thingy, and it does. That's actually what these two are on right now, and they look pretty good. So if you want to go for a more traditional just 00 Gundam, but you still want to have the cool 00 riser with the GN Sword 3 coming out of it, you can do that, and it looks cool. I mean, they overall look really good together, regardless whether or not they're connected or they're separate. I think this could be, oddly enough, a very Justice-esque scenario where, yeah, occasionally you might want to change it up and put it in a situation like this instead of having it as the 00 riser in one entire unit. Now, overall, they're pretty solid, I do have to say. The riser unit itself is a lot less finicky in its riser form, just because there's not as many moving parts and the 00 is not weighed down as much. Of course, it's on a stand, so that complicates that, but overall, it looks good pretty much any way you cut it. It's a really nicely detailed, nicely put together, fun to build kit that I would say if you're a 00 fan or you have the Exia, this is a must buy. It is a really fun build. The posing is once again a little frustrating, but if you take the time, be very methodical, kind of be patient with it, you're going to get a lot of really cool poses out of it that will make it worth that extra struggle that you didn't necessarily get with the Exia. And to close us out here, I wanted to try to use the real grade hand for something and show off that big beam effect part for the GN Sword 3, and here we go. The 00 riser doing a big slash, and if you don't pay a lot of attention, you won't notice the real grade hand is not around the handle, but that's alright, it's close enough. Overall, wonderful kit, but this has been the Spicer, this has been the Gunpla Network, and as always friends, keep on building.